Thanks, bro.
Thanks, brother.
Thanks, guys. Thank you, guys. Thanks. Appreciate it. Let me talk to you about how special America is. I'm going to tell you how special America is and how we became special and we'll keep it special. When you look back to what we have as a nation, our Constitution really is very unique. This year at the United Nations, there's 193 nations, and that number changes every year. It goes up and down depending on who's had war, revolution. So everybody's got a government, and that's not unusual. We've had governments for 5,800 years, recorded history, thousands of nations, and Cornell University Law School said, how long does the average Constitution last in a nation? And looked at all those thousands of nations, 5,800 years, and they said the average length of a constitution in the history of the world, they said it runs right at 17 years. Okay, that's average in the world. Last September 17th on Constitution Day, we had 234 years under the same piece of paper. Now that's something most Americans are not aware of. They just assume that what we got, everybody else can have, and it just hasn't been that way. We're the only nation in the world that's ever done that. We're the longest ongoing constitutional republic in the history of the world. And it wasn't by accident that we got there, and it won't be by accident that we keep it. You have to deliberately pay attention to the principles that got you there. And so what were some of those principles? Because when you look back to the founding fathers who wrote the Constitution, everybody had access to the same set of ideas back then. It had been written down in books everywhere. So what books did they choose, and what did they use to come up with those ideas that gave us our founding documents? And a lot of political scientists have asked that. As a matter of fact, University of Houston political science has said, okay, where did the founding fathers get these ideas? Because it made us different from all other nations back then, even today. And where'd they get them? And so that was a question they asked. They did a lot of research, 10-year project, and their research was published in a book called The Origins of American Constitutionalism, put out by LSU Press. And they said, you know, we think if we can go back and get 15,000 representative writings out of the founding era, and we read what they wrote, and we see who they quoted, we'll know where they got their ideas, which is a brilliant thing. If I followed you around all day with a smart device, at the end of the day, if I heard who you quoted, I'd know who you thought was important. And so they did that. So they found in those 15,000 writings some 3,154 direct quotes in those writings, and it took them 10 years to go back to the origin of every one of those quotes. At the end of 10 years, they had identified the most frequently quoted sources in the American founding. The #1 most cited individual in the American founding was Baron Charles Montesquieu. In 1750, he wrote a 2-volume book called The Spirit of the Laws. That's where they learned so much about separation of powers, other things. The second most cited individual was Judge William Blackstone. William Blackstone had been a judge and wrote 4-volume commentary on the laws. And it was Thomas Jefferson said that American attorneys read Blackstone's commentaries the same way Muslims read the Quran. So they were that dedicated to that book. They studied it. It was highly cited. The third most cited individual was John Locke. John Locke, the 2 treatises of government, this is particularly what we used in writing the Declaration. Richard Henry Lee, a signer of the Declaration, says, we quote, we copied the Declaration out of the 2 treatises of government. So huge impact in the Declaration of Independence. But interestingly, those are the 3 most cited individuals. What they found was the single most cited source in the American founding was the Bible, with 34%. The Bible was cited 4 times more often than Montesquieu and Locke, 4 times more often than Montesquieu and Blackstone, and 12 times more often than Locke. So the Bible is the #1 cited source at the base of the American founding. So they came up with a lot of ideas that we don't recognize today, and I'll show you why we don't recognize a lot of the biblical ideas today. A lot of it deals with our education. We know so little about the Bible in general. We know so little about history in general, and I'll show you some of that. But you look at America, not only are we special with our Constitution, but we're special with other things as well. In addition to our 234 years, we have an unprecedented amount of creativity. We are 4% of the world's population, and when you check copyright, patent protection, etc., our 4% has produced more inventions, more cures, more discovery, more technology, more medical, everything than the other 96% of the world. Now, 4% of the world's population should produce 4% of the world's whatever. Our 4% has produced more than 96%, and we live with that on a daily basis. We just assume that what we have is what other people enjoy, what other nations enjoy, and it's not. And the same thing, even when you look at prosperity, for the last several years, America, our 4% of the world's population, produces somewhere between 23, 24, 25% of the world's GDP. And that affects our individual prosperity. Every 10 years, the Constitution requires that we do a census. So we did one in 2020. The results were released in 2021. And according to census data from 2021, if you live in poverty in America, which we don't want anyone living in poverty, but if you live in poverty in America, your lifestyle is higher than the middle class in Europe, which is the second wealthiest place on the face of the earth. The World Bank sets a global standard for poverty at $1,000 a year. They say if you live on $1,000 a year or less, you're in poverty. In America, you have states like Hawaii, Mississippi, others that say, well, unless you make more than $61,000 a year, you should not come off government services, because that's what you get on government services. 1,000 and 61,000, and see, we don't even know that. We just assume that what we are is what everybody else is, and it's just not even close to that. And people who come to America and try to get in, they understand how different we are. Americans don't often understand how different we are. But even foreign folks back 2 centuries ago understood. In 1831, a young French official, Justice Department official, came from France here to see about the Justice Department in America. When he got here, he was so enthralled with everything he saw that he wrote a book talking about all of America. It's called Democracy in America. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote that. It's published in 1835. And in that book, he came up with the term that still applied to America. The term he used was American exceptionalism. He said the condition of the Americans is quite exceptional, and it may be believed that no democratic people will ever be placed in a similar position. And so this is where we get the term American exceptionalism. Now, a lot of people say, well, you're being braggy. You're bragging about how special you are. No, no, no. This means we're the exception, not the rule. This is American exceptional. We're the exception and not the rule when it comes to stability. And by the way, we look at what happens in Ukraine and says, isn't that tragic? It is tragic, but it's normal. You see, the average nation, the typical nation averages a violent revolution every generation, and they average a new constitution every 17 years. I was asked to go to Ukraine 7 years ago when Putin invaded Crimea there, like he did Belarus this time, he invaded Crimea. And at that point in time, they said, you know, we really need a new constitution. Well, you had one in 1992. Yeah, but it's old. We need a new one. So it's that 17-year kind of a cycle that we get into, and we're just not used to the fact that people have that kind of a turnover. So American exceptionalism, we got ideas that were different from everybody else in the world, but everybody had access to them. Ours, you know, whether it's Montesquieu and Black's Own Locke or the Bible, everybody had access to that. Our founders used it in a way that no one else had ever used it. And so who would be the leaders responsible for what we still enjoy today under American exceptionalism? Well, it'd probably be the guys who wrote our documents. It'd be guys like George Washington. It'd be guys like John Hancock and John Adams and others like that. And they're good choices. I mean, they had a huge impact. But it's interesting to me that John Adams in 1816 was asked a question by a guy named Hezekiah Niles. Hezekiah Niles is what we would call a millennial of that generation. He was a young man. He had not gone through the American War for Independence like John Adams had, but he was writing a history book. His history book came out in 1822. It's called Principles and Acts of the American Revolution. And in writing Adams, he said, look, I'm doing a history book on the history of America. I wasn't there when it happened. You were, and we really appreciate what we've got today, but you were the eyewitness. You were the big participant. You saw what happened. And so I'm interviewing you, and I want to know from your perspective, these ideas that you came up with, where'd you get those ideas? Where'd you find them? Who influenced you? Who helped shape your thinking? And so John Adams said, well, if you want to know where I got ideas and who was a great influence in our thinking in the American founding, he said right up top I'd put the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper. And then I'd add the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, and there's the Reverend George Whitfield. And by the way, but Franklin and Jefferson and Adams all talked about the impact of Whitfield, particularly on the first Congress in 1774. And then John Adams said, and there's Charles Chauncey. He starts listing preachers. Now today we might know who Whitfield is, but the chances that we know anything about Cooper or Mayhew or Chauncey, that's slim to none. And yet John Adams said these are the guys that had the biggest impact on the founding of the nation. And see, today we don't study preachers whether they're white or black. I mean, who in the world is Richard Allen or Absalom Jones, or who's someone like John Morant or Lemuel Haynes, or for that matter even Harry Hoosier. Now Harry Hoosier, by the way, interesting individual. He was part of what's called the Great Awakenings, and in that point in time, we would say, well, Great Awakenings, that would be people like George Whitfield. That'd be people like John and Charles Wesley. It would be people like Francis Asbury. It'd be folks like that. And it's interesting that these names all drew massive crowds, 20, 30, 40,000 in a field. And Francis Asbury said, yeah, but Harry Hoosier draws bigger crowds than we do. He says he gets much bigger crowds than I do. Interesting. Never heard the guy. And Harry Hoosier was heard by founding fathers like Benjamin Rush. We'll talk more about him later. But John Adams said of all that 250 folks that we call founding fathers, he said Benjamin Rush is one of the three most notable. He said you got George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Benjamin Rush. Now, we don't much know Benjamin Rush today, but Benjamin Rush said, I've been to Harry's meetings. I've heard him preach. He said, he's the greatest orator I have ever heard. You've heard Patrick Henry. You've heard all the really good guys, yeah, but nobody's as good as Harry. And Harry's ministry really was all along the East Coast, and it was to really what we would call blue-collar kind of folks. The guys who liked going to his meetings were the rough-and-tumble kind of guys, the guys off the frontier. They loved hunting and trapping, and they loved exploring, and they loved wildlife and wilderness, and they would go on what's called long hunts. They would go on a hunting trip, and they would come back 6 to 8 months later, having discovered some new valley or river or whatever. And they would be gone for months at a time, but they had really rough lives. They cussed a lot, they drank a lot, they fought a lot. And a lot of them got converted under Harry's ministry. Now, when they did, their behavior changed. They didn't cuss as much, and they didn't fight as much, and they didn't drink as much, but they were still rough and tumble guys and still rugged guys who loved the wilderness. And it's interesting that Harry's ministry was largely along the East Coast. It was Philadelphia and here in Jersey, and it was up into Delaware. And so his ministry here, as America started moving west, by the time you got to 1805, 1806, 1807, we've moved much further west. And as you get to that point in time, when the explorers got out there, they would look at others, and they saw the converts, and they said, man, these guys sure act different. What's up with them? And the answer was always, well, they're a bunch of those Hoosiers. Now, Hoosiers, this was the Indiana Territory. Its name is the Hoosier State. And I wonder how many people in Indiana know that they were named after black evangelists. Probably not many. Now, that's a lot. I mean, you would think that somebody of that stature with the state named after him might make a history book somewhere, but it doesn't happen. And see, this is part of the problem we have with American history today. Did you notice that 30 years ago we were not teaching critical race theory? Why was that? Because we knew too much more about our history 30 years ago that we don't even know now. And we don't know Harry Hoosier now. We didn't know him 30 years ago. There's so many guys we didn't know 30 years ago. But what we're told today is, well, the American founding was all a bunch of white guys. Now, let me point out something here that's of interest, is back then, obviously, no cameras. So how do we know what these guys looked like? If you were famous, if you did something really significant, they painted a picture of you. Everybody didn't get a picture painted. If you got a picture painted, you were something significant, which that's why we know what the founding fathers were. All 56 of these guys had paintings done of them. It's interesting, they're not the only ones that did. I mean, you start looking at all these black paintings that are up there, and these aren't just black individuals, they're black heroes who had a notable impact on the nation. And we don't even know who they are today. But we think all of our history was all white because that's what we're told. And we're told that because nobody knows the other part of our history. And see, there's so much more. In the American War for Independence, every battle in the American War for Independence had integrated units. There wasn't segregation. And it's interesting that it was a total volunteer army. You had to enlist, and you had to re-enlist, and that's the only way you kept fighting, because the terms of enlistment were anywhere from 3 months to a year. You chose your term of enlistment. And it's interesting that the average black soldier in the American War for Independence served 9 times longer than the average white soldier. They kept enlisting and re-enlisting and going back and serving. And that's why in every battle in the American War for Independence, you had not only black soldiers, you had black heroes like these guys that came out as very notable people because of what they did. Now, we don't know our history today, so we can say it was all white, but that's not. And for that matter, if you even take Chaim Solomon, if you don't know, this is Jewish financier of the Revolution, close friend of George Washington, Robert Morris, the other founding fathers. And when Washington didn't have enough money to keep the troops in the field, he's the one who came up with so much of it. And back then, you can understand that, you know, you've got a bunch of shopkeepers and farmers and school teachers that are taking on the greatest military power in the world. Who's going to give you a loan on that that deal. You know, nobody's going to give you money on that. And that's why it had to be done privately. And Chaim Solomon was the guy who kept washing in the field. Now, significantly with that, if you go to Chicago, to the financial district today in Chicago, this statue is there. It's George Washington holding the hands of two men. He's got Chaim Solomon in one hand, he's got Robert Morris in the other, the two financiers, one Christian, one Jew. Washington saying, here's the guys who helped us win. Here's the guys who kept us in the field. And see, just like we don't know anything about black history, we know very little about any other history as well. Colonel Isaac Franks, the Jewish synagogue leader who was a colonel in the Revolution, had a huge impact, as did his brother, Colonel David Franks. And Francis Salvador was the first Jewish man elected to office in America, elected in 1775, and becomes a martyr in the American Revolution. The first Jew killed in the American Revolution, Francis Salvador. You also have Mordecai Sheftel, a Jewish leader who was leader of the Patriot forces in Georgia. Most folks have no clue that Christian units led by a Jewish leader. You have so many others you can point to, Jewish soldiers, Jewish patriots, even synagogue leaders that were actively involved in the war. We don't know anything about the Jewish element, but again, it's all white. It's all Christian. No, it's interesting that when you look at George Washington's presidential inauguration, there were 7 different religious activities at Washington's inauguration. That's more than have been in any other inauguration. No other inaugurations had all 7 activities that Washington did. All of them have had part of the things that Washington did, but none of them has had the 7 that Washington did. And it's significant. His inauguration was set up by 14 religious leaders, which included both rabbis and pastors. So even back at Washington's time, Jews and Christians, side by side, fought side by side, worked side by side, helped guide the administration side by side. That was the counselors we had. And this is a famous lithograph that came out in Europe. Now, this lithograph in Europe shows Washington's generals, at least part of them. See, why this was popular in Europe is that this was all of his foreign generals, generals from Poland and Lithuania, generals from Germany, generals from Prussia. Washington, out of the 76 generals he had, 28 of his generals came from foreign nations. We were a melting pot back then. Now, we were built on biblical principles, as you just saw, 34% of the quotes in the founding era, and the Constitution is filled with Bible phrases and Bible verses. Back then, they did not feel the need to tell you they were quoting the Bible because everybody knew it, but today we don't know it, and we think it's a secular document. It's interesting. I can take you through the Constitution and have you look up a verse in the Bible and have you read a phrase in the Constitution and say, that is exactly the same thing. Yeah, it sure is. So when people today tell me the Constitution is a secular document, what they're really doing is they're telling me that they are biblically illiterate. They wouldn't recognize a Bible verse if it bit them in the ankle. And because the Founding Fathers didn't feel like they had to tell you it's the Bible verse because everybody knew it, it's just an American difference. And matter of fact, you've probably seen this painting before, Washington Cross in Delaware, great patriotic painting, right? That is not an American painting. It didn't even come to America till a long time after. That was a painting done in the mid-1800s, and it was done in Germany. Why Germany? Because in 1848, Das Kapital came out, Marxism was introduced. And Marxism started dividing the nation, saying the only way you can be strong is to be divided in groups and have the groups fight each other. We need this group fighting this group. And, you know, we've done that in America forever. I mean, first it was age, and then it was sex, and now it's on race. And so we go through this thing. Marxism always has to have a conflict. There's always got to be 2 groups fighting. And that's why we're all divided into groups. Are you gay or are you straight? Are you union or are you right to work? Or are you South or are you North? Are you Christian or are you Jew? Are you whatever? We're always in groups. We're not individuals. We're in groups, and that comes from Marxism. And so as Germany was being torn apart, a German artist painted this painting for Germany, and it hung in Germany and was distributed around Germany. It says, hey, the Americans have got it right. They're all in the same boat. And in that boat, you have a woman there on the right toward the back. You have a woodsman up front. You have a black man. You have a Scottish immigrant. It's just some of everybody that was in America at the time. And they're saying this is what makes America special, is they're all in the same boat. We in Europe need to get in the same boat and stop being these groups. And so that was the reaction to Marx. Now, we look at that like it's a great American painting. It's not. That's the way foreign nations saw America, was the great diversity, and yet we're all able to be together. And so as you look at what John Adams said, why would John Adams have pointed to a bunch of preachers and said, these are the guys responsible for what we enjoy today? Why would he have told a young man that? Well, it's interesting. Even today's historians have documented that every right set forth in the Declaration of Independence had been preached from the American pulpit prior to 1763. So if you want a fun assignment, Read the Declaration of Independence as a listing of sermon topics, because that's what it was. That's what they'd been teaching in America for 15 years before we wrote the document. What's in the Declaration is what we've been hearing out of churches and out of pulpits and out of our religious leaders. And this is the kind of history we don't know much about today. And it goes really back to a phrase here I want to show you from George Orwell. Orwell says, who controls the past, controls the future, controls the present, controls the past. Notice the two phrases here. Who controls the past, controls the future. Our future is built on what we see ourselves as having been in the past. That's a direct influence. So if it's going to be the 1619 Project, we'll start looking like the 1619 Project wants us to look. Terrible history, by the way. So whatever it is, whatever the past is, that's going to affect who we are. If we knew our own history and how we'd been a great melting pot and how we had been really Christian principles, but that was freedom for everybody. I mean, Christians and Jews got along so well, blacks and whites got along so well. Yes, there was racism, and I can show you more instances of racism than the 1619 Project can. But I can also show you that America was the first nation in the world to have an entire region abolish slavery. The New England states, the northern states had all abolished slavery by 1804. Nobody else in the world had done that. And on top of that, America was the first nation in the world to abolish the slave trade, which we did in March 1807. Nobody did before we did. And then on top of that, in 1819, we put an entire naval squadron called the Africa Squadron off the coast of Africa to keep any other nations from taking their ships to Africa and taking slaves out of Africa. Now, the African coast was massive. It was long. We didn't stop them all, but we stopped hundreds of ships. We turned them back. Then when the Civil War started, we had to bring the Navy home so we could fight the Confederacy. And at that point in time, Great Britain says, we'll take care of it. And so Great Britain went to the Africa Squadron. They started blocking the coast the best they could. And Great Britain becomes the first nation in the world to abolish slavery, and they did so in 1833. America was the fourth nation in the world to abolish slavery, which was in 1865. That's only 150 years ago. So 150 years ago, we're out of 128 nations in the world at that time, we're fourth, which puts us in the top of the world leaders. We led the way in so many areas. We're fourth in abolishing slavery. And even as you look at the African slave trade, which went from 1501 to 1875, in that period of time, 12.7 million slaves were taken out of Africa. We debate professors all the time, and a professor recently said, a kid asked him, he said, where'd all those slaves go? And he said, they all went to America. No, I'm sorry, 47% of them went to Brazil, 26% went to Great Britain, 11% went to France, 10% went to Denmark. America got 2.5% of the slaves that were taken out of Africa. Now, we shouldn't have taken any, but we're not the world's greatest defending nation out there by a long shot. We're way down on the other end of it. And as a matter of fact, if slavery really concerns you, which it should, you should know that right now, out of the 193 nations in the world, 94 still have not abolished slavery today. There are 40 million active slaves in the world right now as we sit here, which is 3 times more than we had in 400 years of the African slave trade. And we want to look back then instead of look at what's going on now. And we don't even want to look at how that America was the one who started the abolition movement in the world, and it changed Wilberforce. He looked to America. It was New England that it shaped him. And so we just don't even know that history now. And so the view of the past controls the future. But here's the more important part. It says who controls the present controls the past. The way we teach history right now affects what we know about the past, which affects what we will be in the future. There's an easy way to see this. We have, in America, we have what are called AP courses. They're done by the College Board. They're advanced placement courses. College Board does the SAT test. And the advanced placement test, I think they do 47, I think, advanced placement tests. But if you're a kid in high school that's really good, you're really sharp, you can take an AP high school course and get college credit for it. So you get college high school credit at the same time. So if you look at AP U.S. History, the AP U.S. History course, 460,000 students a year in America take AP U.S. History. That's advanced history. These are the smartest kids in history, and this is the test they take, and this is what they're taught. Standards came out in 2014, 2015, and it's interesting, those standards are 162 pages long. Now, the 162 pages and those standards, when you look at what's in the text, it's fairly interesting. Now, I've been appointed in a number of states to review history and social studies standards in those states, and when I look at standards, I don't look for what's in the standards, I look for what's not in the standards. It's what doesn't appear that tells you what they're trying to change. What does appear, nobody's going to say Abraham Lincoln dropped a nuclear weapon on Taiwan in World War XVIII. We'd all laugh at that. But see, if they stop teaching Abraham Lincoln and you don't get him for 30 or 40 years, then you can reintroduce him and introduce him with things that nobody's ever heard of before. And oh, I've never heard that before. That's interesting. And that's what you look for. You look for what's taken out, because once it disappears for a while, it'll come back in later with a different viewpoint. So what do we not have in the standards when they came out in 2014 or 2015? Well, for one thing, we didn't have founding fathers. For example, you won't find Thomas Jefferson, you won't find Ben Franklin, you won't find John Adams or James Madison, that they were not there. You won't find the American War for Independence there. There was nothing about the Battle of Lexington, or the Battle of Bunker Hill, or the Battle of Saratoga, or the Battle of Yorktown. And Lincoln, no, Lincoln's not there either. So there's no Lincoln base, there's no Emancipation Proclamation, no Gettysburg Address. There's not even the assassination of Lincoln. And then if there's not Lincoln, there's not a Civil War. So neither Lee nor Grant nor any of the battles in the Civil War. If you move into the 20th century, significantly, there's not D-Day. There's none of the major battles. There was no D-Day. There was no Pearl Harbor, Iwo Jima, no Midway. There were no military leaders. There was nothing about Eisenhower. There was nothing about Patton. There was nothing about MacArthur or Nimitz. Matter of fact, there wasn't even an enemy. There was nothing about Hitler. There was nothing about the Nazis. There was nothing about the Holocaust. All of this is out of the AP U.S. History course. Now, we're not teaching that. That's not part of history anymore. Significantly, if we're not teaching that, what do we teach? Well, we teach things like the 1619 Project. We introduce something totally ahistorical. 1619 is not when slavery got started in Virginia. And by the way, the 1619 Project says 1619 is when slavery started in the New World. That's not even close. The Spanish introduced slavery into Carolinas in 1526. The Spanish introduced slavery into Florida in 1545. As a matter of fact, 1619, some slaves came to Virginia and they were all freed because slavery was illegal in Virginia. Those slaves all became landowners. One of them, Anthony Johnson, was a black landowner, became very prosperous, and he had another black man working for him, and he said, this is the laziest guy ever. He went to court in 1653 and asked the court to give him the right to own that man for the rest of his life because he was so lazy, and the court said, sure. So the first occasion of legal slavery in America is when a black man sues on another black man, and it wasn't 1619, it was 1653. I don't think they put that in the 1619 thing, but because 1619 came out, we got to tear down all the statues and destroy everything because America is so inherently racistly corrupt. Slavery is a problem of human nature. It affects all colors, all races, all people, everywhere. I help run an organization. I'll tell you a little bit more about it later, but it's called the Nazarene Fund. We save persecuted Christians all over the world, including sex trafficking and slavery. We do rescue operations almost on a daily basis, snatching Christians out of slave trades. They're in slavery literally. And so right now you've got 9.2 million slaves in Africa. You've got we know 3 million in China. We don't know how many more there are because you don't have open records, but there's 40 million right now. So this is a big deal. So looking at what's there, what they do talk about in the standards that came out in 2014, 2015, it says the decision to drop the atomic bomb raised questions about American values. Now understand, you haven't heard about Germany, you haven't heard about Japan, but America dropped an atomic bomb, and that raised questions about American values. Did it really? It's interesting. There's more to the story. If you look at what's there in World War II, you may recall that there were 68 million deaths in World War II. There were 20 million in the Pacific theater, there were 48 million in the European theater, and the European theater, the way we got that war to come to a close in Europe was we finally had to invade the mainland. We invaded on D-Day, and as a result, we have D-Day, then the Battle of Bulge, then we penetrate the Siegfried Line, and we push the Germans back into Germany, and they surrender, and the war's over. We were following what was called the Germany First policy. We've got war on both sides of the world, but we're going to put all of our attention on defeating Germany. Then when we get them whipped, we're going to turn all of our attention to defeating Japan. So we're going to keep Japan busy over here with what we can, but we're putting our attention on Germany. So once Hitler surrenders, and by the way, that was called Operation Overlord, is what D-Day was. Once Hitler surrenders, then we turn our attention to Japan. Now, Japan should not have been involved at this point. There were 130 nations involved in World War II. Japan is the last one standing. All the others have either won or lost. She's got no allies. She has no help. The big ones, Hitler with Germany and Mussolini with Italy, they're gone. So she's got no help, and she won't surrender. She keeps fighting, and she just will not. So we don't want to lose any more American lives or Allied lives, the New Zealanders and the Australians and the British, the French. So what we do is we start bombing from the air. We got to convince her that she's going to surrender. And so we start sending B-29 bombers out, and we just bomb from the air by the thousands, by the tens of thousands. We drop bombs, and she still won't surrender. So what happens is we said, man, how are we in this war? We may have to do an invasion of Japan like we did in Europe. And it was called Operation Downfall. And so here's all the different groups coming in. Here's where the French come in, and here's where the British come in, here's where the Americans come in. And we knew that if we invaded, we're looking at some casualties, and so wanted to figure out how many casualties, what would it cost us if we have to invade? And so General Curtis LeMay, who was the general over the Army Air Corps at the time, became the Air Force later. General Curtis LeMay said, I want the estimates. If we have to do this land invasion to subdue Japan, what will it cost us? And they came back and said, well, it'll cost at least 1 million American soldiers. And by the way, before I show you Curtis LeMay, you need to understand that the Japanese were much like ISIS. They'll be the last one standing. They're going to fight till they all get killed. And we saw that in so many ways. Even as we were island hopping across, we were starting to go through Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima. Every Japanese family was given a hand grenade and said, if the Allies win, make sure you blow yourself and your children up. And that's why in all of those Pacific theater battles, the Japanese casualty numbers are so high, because they killed themselves rather than surrender. And so that's kind of the way ISIS was. Mass suicides, what I just mentioned, hand grenades for every family. Also on top of that, they beheaded and killed 10 million Chinese. So you have Hitler, who kills 7 million Jews, 6 million Gentiles. The Chinese, 10 million were killed by Japan, because Japan hated the Chinese. Then in addition to the 10 million that were killed there, they trained their young people to be suicide bombers like ISIS does. There were 3,400 suicide bombs delivered by these young people. Some of them were in planes. They teach these young people to fly planes and go hit the Americans. But even with torpedoes, and can you imagine, it's not enough just to send a torpedo to a boat. You've got to ride it to the boat until it hits the boat. And just the whole mentality is something unlike anything in the Western world. We just didn't understand how to deal with it. And so as we looked at prisoner treatment, the Japanese prisoner of war camps, the officers would have beheading competitions to see who could behead 100 soldiers the fastest. They often had runoffs between it. The officers, if they were really good at beheading, we have a lot of records of officers talking about how they would take a prisoner at random. If they were having a bad week, they just grab a prisoner at random, go out and make him dig his own grave, kneel down, behead him. And the officer said, I felt good for 2 weeks after that. Then I have to go get another prisoner. I mean, just the whole mentality was really crazy. Prisoner treatment, the death marches, Saipan, what they did at Bataan, it actually led to American posters being put out, war posters. It says, this isn't war, it's murder. Japs bayonet U.S. wounded, ambush in Pacific Island. If you were slow, if you were sick, if you were injured, just kill you on the spot. As a matter of fact, we found this early in the war when the Japanese captured one of our submarines. We surrendered a submarine, and the Japanese took every American sailor up on deck, laid them down on deck, took a sledgehammer and squashed every head like a melon, just went down the road doing it. And so we had an early introduction to what it means to surrender to the Japanese. And so this is what we've had going, and it's a culture that glorified death and dying. So the question is, all right, if we have to invade Japan, Curtis LeMay said, what's it going to cost us? And they said, well, you're looking at 1 million American deaths, you're looking at 2 to 4 million Allied deaths, and you'll have to kill 5 to 10 million of the Japanese before they'll surrender. So you're looking at 15 million more that'll die before the Japanese will end the war. And at that point is when Harry Truman said, no. He said, last week we tested a bomb out in the desert and the test was successful. I'm not going to take 15 million lives. We're going to use that bomb. And so on the 6th of August, we dropped the first bomb. 3 days later, the Japanese still would not surrender. We dropped the second bomb. We were going to drop a third bomb on the 12th of August, but they were getting close to surrender. So on the 14th of August, they do surrender. But we were going to drop a bomb every 3 days till they did. And we're not going to take Allied Allied lives anymore. It's just not going to be. If they won't surrender, that's what we're going to do. So it's interesting when you look at what happened with the death of those bombs. Those bombs resulted in 300,000 deaths. There was 150,000 deaths immediately from the blast, 150,000 more over the next 2 or 3 years from radiation. You compare 300,000 deaths to 15 million, and I'm not sure what the question is with American values. I don't think I understand the problem with this. Maybe we shouldn't have dropped the atomic bomb and gone in and killed 5 to 10 million Japanese and lost 5 million ourselves. No, but see, that's what we're teaching. And the other part that we don't teach is what happened before we dropped even one bomb on Japan. What we did was oh, by the way, the 300,000 Japanese killed, we have records that in one prisoner of war camp, the Japanese beheaded more than 300,000 Allied prisoners. This is in Australia. 300,000 Allied prisoners in one prisoner of war camp. In one prisoner of war camp, they beheaded more than we killed with 2 atomic bombs, and it's our values that are in question. And that's what we're teaching young people is, hey, the bad guys in World War II was the Americans because they used the atomic bomb. So you go past that and look at the devastation from those 2 bombs. Before we dropped even a bomb on Japan, we dropped these leaflets. We dropped a total of roughly 70 million of these leaflets, and on the back, we own these leaflets. On the back of the leaflets, in Japanese, it says, Japanese people, here are the 35 cities we're going to bomb. Hiroshima, Nagasaki were on the list. It said these cities all have military production facilities. We're going to end the war. We're going to stop the military production, but we want every civilian to get away from those facilities, but here's where we're going to bomb. Now, you can imagine the American pilots did not like this, because where did the Japanese now set up all their anti-aircraft? Around those 35 cities. So we're going into bomb cities where we've warned them we're coming, and now American lives are in danger. And so even when we dropped the atomic bomb, we set up a radio station on Saipan. We'd just taken the island of Saipan, and that radio station is called KSAI. Every 15 minutes, we broadcast a warning to the Japanese mainland, Japanese people, bomb is coming, get away. They said, you've seen what a B-29 will do? We have one bomb with the capability of 2,000 B-29 bombers. We have one bomb, get away, we're going to use it. So we warned the Japanese every 15 minutes, and then after that, we ended up rebuilding the cities we blew up. How does that raise questions about American values? See, this is what we're teaching in this generation about the past, and this will affect our future. Because if we're the bad guys, we can't be the bad guys anymore. We got to do what everybody else in the world does. We were different even back then. Did you know when we rebuilt Japan, MacArthur was put in charge of rebuilding Japan, and that's a hard thing to do because they've got thousands of years of that mentality and that culture. And he said the only way you can rebuild Japan is we have to get a different spiritual mentality. So he asked for 5,000 missionaries to go to Japan, and he asked for Bibles to come to Japan. It's interesting, for the next 3 years, the best-selling book in Japan was the Bible. And within 7 years, you had that culture, you had Japanese welcome back into the world culture, and they've been a different culture ever since. We gave women all the rights to vote, all the equal political rights. We took the land away from the handful of landowners, and we shared it among the people, said, you've got private property, here's what free enterprise looks like. We're not going to have military Shintoism anymore. You can choose your own religion, but it's not going to be military Shintoism. I mean, remade the entire nation in 7 years, and they've been a different nation ever since. Doesn't even look like the nation before World War II. So this is the kind of stuff we get, and that's what's in the history stuff being taught. It's all called deconstruction. Deconstruction is, history tells you the good, the bad, the ugly. Look at King David in the Bible. He's a great worshiper. He's a great leader. He's a great patriot. He's a terrible father. Just look at Absalom and Amnon, and look at Adonijah. And he murders a man and steals his wife, commits adultery. That's good, bad, and ugly. Bible tells you all of it, but there's a whole lot more good than there is bad and ugly. Not that bad and ugly wasn't bad and ugly, it was. But he repented, had a change of heart. His heart was for God. And so we know him as basically a really good guy with some flaws along the way. If the only thing you studied about David was the bad and the ugly, you would never read another psalm in the Bible for your whole life. Who wants to read a psalm written by a guy like that? See, that's what we've done to America. We've taken all the good out, and we've highlighted everything bad and ugly. And it goes back to a book that came out in 1980. Howard Zinn is the one who really got this going in the modern era. And his book, People's History of the United States, he took all the bad and ugly he could find, including made up some bad and ugly, and said, this is what America is. And so this is the way we've taught history since that point in time. So this becomes a significant statement for where we are. So back to John Adams, talking about the influence of the church, the pulpit, the scriptures. He said, our pulpits have thundered, and it's easy to prove because we own thousands of sermons from back then. And what they did back then that I don't think we do well today is they addressed biblical relevancy. Let me quickly take you through some sermons. This is a sermon preached in 1755 because they had an earthquake in Boston, which is not common in Boston. So if it was in the headlines, we said, here's what the Bible says about it. Frankly, I can't think of many Bible verses on earthquakes, but I will point out that is a 5-week sermon on earthquakes. See at the bottom, 5 parts. I couldn't do 20 minutes on earthquakes. I went online recently and just looked up earthquakes in the Bible. It is amazing how many earthquakes. You have earthquakes in Chronicles. You have earthquakes with King Uzziah. You have earthquakes mentioned in Amos. You have all. I've never even paid attention to it, but we did. We covered natural disasters. It didn't matter if it was earthquakes or if it was floods or if it was fires, whatever it was. We had sermons like this one. This is a sermon on comets, or 2 sermons occasioned by the late blazing star. There's so much in the Bible and astronomy. Even in the book of Job, God calls Pleiades by name, and he calls Orion by name. There's so much in the scriptures on science and astronomy, which is interesting. Some of the greatest scientists in the history of the world wrote more on theology than they did on science, like Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and others. So the Bible is a great book on science. In the same way, this sermon, The Infirmities and Comforts of Old Age, probably not a super popular topic, but it's a really important topic because everybody grows old. And so since we do, and we deal with parents who are growing old, we had sermons on aging. This is a sermon on religion and patriotism, the constituents of a good soldier, all sorts of military stuff in the Bible, so much military stuff in the Bible. As a matter of fact, even John the Baptist, when he was baptizing, he had specific instructions for officers and for soldiers. So we had a lot on the military. This is a sermon. It says the relation of the medical profession to the ministry, a discourse or sermon preached in West Church, Boston, 1854, healthcare. May I quickly take you just a refresher to remember something happened in the Bible significant. Genesis 11, we're introduced to Abraham. You remember from Abraham, the lineage was Abraham, then Isaac and Jacob had wives, Rachel and Leah, and they had 12 sons. Probably the most famous of the 12 sons is probably Joseph. He gets more time in the Bible than any others, and he was sold into slavery. Family thought he's dead. He ends up in Egypt, ends up being the number 2 guy in Egypt. Then there's a famine that hits the world, and family says, we need food. They go to Egypt. And he ends up getting reunited with his brethren. He says, how's my dad? How's he doing? And let's go see Dad. So he gets reunited with Dad. Dad thought he's been dead for all these years. So he's reunited with Dad. He says, hey, just bring the family to Egypt. Great place. I've got influence there. And so they load the family up and bring them to Egypt. And it works really well for a while. But then eventually, as we're told in the scriptures, the Pharaohs forgot who they were and forgot what was there, and so they suddenly end up in slavery. Not suddenly, they slowly end up in slavery, where they're in slavery for the next 400 years. And after 400 years, it's like God says, okay, I've had it. No more of this. It's time to change. And that's when he sent Charlton Heston to deliver the Jews. No, sorry, my bad. Sent Moses to deliver. But the 10 Commandments movie, if you haven't seen it, you ought to see the 10 Commandments movie. But Moses, and we know that the 10 plagues happen, and so God brought him out of Egypt, and he destroys the Egyptians in the Red Sea. And then he gets them out to the mountain, and he leads them with a pillar of cloud, pillar of fire, and they're now at the mountain. And understand what's going on here. The Israelites have been in slavery for 400 years. And you know what the problem with that is? When you've been a slave for 400 years, you act like a slave, you think like a slave, you behave like a slave, everything, you're just thinking wrong. So he says, guys, I've got your full attention. You don't know where you're going. There's nobody chasing you. Let's give you a new way of looking at things. So God delivers not just the 10 Commandments we often focus on. He delivers 613 laws. The 613 laws is everything the nation needed, and they became the greatest empire in the ancient world. They went from being slaves to being the greatest empire because he said, here's everything you need to know. And if you go through the 613 laws, you find that they cover everything under the sun, including health care. As a matter of fact, way back in Exodus 15:26, God, after having said that, Moses says, okay, God says, if you'll do all the stuff he told you in health care, he says, quote, I will put on you none of the diseases that I put upon Egypt. If you'll follow follow my health care code, you won't have the same medical problems that they do elsewhere. And Egypt and Assyria and Babylon, they all believed they were the smart guys in the day. It turns out that they weren't. There was a book done by Dr. S.I. McMillan, says, you know, at the time, everybody thought the Hebrew medical code was really backwards, but it turns out we now have dozens of studies to show all those health provisions in the Bible actually make medical scientific sense. It just took us about 3,800 years to figure that out. So that's why you had sermons on health care even back then. This is a sermon on the character and tendency of the property tax adapted to a permanent system of taxation by Reverend Glover. So economics, yeah, because the Bible talks about estate taxes, inheritance taxes. Jesus taught on what we call the minimum wage and what we call the capital gains tax. There's capitation taxes, there's flat taxes, there's progressive tax. Bible is one of the best economic books ever. And so we just don't seem to have much knowledge of that, but we had sermons on it. This is a sermon on the sinfulness and pernicious nature of gaming, and this is done in Williamsburg in 1751 before the General Assembly of Virginia. This is a sermon on the liquor law of Massachusetts. See, we said, oh, it's in the newspaper. They passed a new law this week in the legislature. Here's the subject of the law. Here's what the Bible says. Okay, that's a good law, and that's why it's called a good law, because they looked at the law, examined it against the scriptures, and said, okay, that's a good law. Here's one on the injustice and policy of the slave trade, slavery to Africans. It was church people, it was faith people that understood the promise of the declaration that all men are created equal. This is the way God created them. They have equal value, equal worth. That's why God does not allow murder, because that's taking a human life, and all lives have value. So it was the abolition movement came really out of the church, out of the pulpits. This is a sermon on marriage scripturally considered, 1837. This came out of New Hampshire, where they had a law that dealt with marriage, and we said, well, here's what the Bible says about marriage. Here's what the law says. Okay, that law's okay because it matches up with what the scripture says. Here you see the higher law, application of the Fugitive Slave Bill. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Bill, which is, out of the millions of laws Congress has passed, it's one of the three, hands down, one of the three worst laws the federal Congress ever passed. It was passed in 1850, went into effect in 1851. I've got stacks of sermons on the Fugitive Slave Law from 1851, and here's the way they typically went. Congregation, are you listening to me? Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Law out here. Here's what Congress said in the Fugitive Slave Law. Here's what the Bible says. When you look at the Bible and you look at what Congress said, are you guys listening? And you know, it's that kind of tone. Pay attention. If you obey the federal Fugitive Slave Law, you are disobeying God's law. If you're going to obey God's law, you have to disobey the federal law. It called for widespread civil disobedience all over America based on what the Bible said. It's what we often see in the Bible, whether it's the Hebrew midwives, whether it's Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, whatever it is. You got a choice. And we see it in the New Testament where the apostles said, well, we got to do what God says, or what the civil authority said. We think we'll do what God says. Amen. So you get to that point where it's that clear. And what happened was the widespread civil disobedience with the Fugitive Slave Law led to two things in American history. The first thing is what we call jury nullification. The jury would be impaneled, and they would bring the guy before the jury, and he's been charged under the Fugitive Slave Law. And the jury said, he's free, because that's such a bad law. We can't convict him under that law. If we did, it would be injustice to convict him. And so jury nullification happened all over America because the law is so bad. And this is back in the time, the Constitution says that juries are to decide the law and the fact, which means the juries were determining the law, whether it was good, and the fact, how they lined up the laws. In 1893, the U.S. Supreme Court, in what's called the Sparf decision, said, well, we don't think we'll let juries decide the law anymore. They just decide the facts. We judges will decide the law. But up to then, it was the people who said, that's an unjust law, and we're not going to follow an unjust law. And it's not just widespread civil disobedience. It had to be biblically based, but that's what we did with these sermons in the pulpit. The second thing is the Fugitive Slave Law, the resistance to it out of the pulpit led to the Underground Railroad. This is the organization of the Underground Railroad, because the Fugitive Slave Law is so bad, we're going to have to get you out of the United States and into Canada if you're going to be safe. And that's what the Underground Railroad did. So here's all sorts of social policy stuff. Here's one of the cry of Sodom inquired into, what we call an LGBTQ sermon. Here's a sermon on elections and voting, government. We had all these things, and these are the kind of sermons that we did back then. Now, significantly with all these sermons, as Adam said, our pulpits have thundered. This is where we learned our thinking. This is how we learned to process what was going with the British. It's significant that we're not at this point anymore. What we know today, we do a lot of national polling, and we know that right now only 9% of Christians read the scriptures on a daily basis. So most people who profess to be Christians know very little about what the book says. They just don't know what's inside it. We're more familiar with what everybody else says, or social media or something else. And then on top of that, what we find is only 6% of Americans have a biblical worldview. Only 1 in 16 can look at something that the Bible talks about and actually put Bible verses to what that policy is. So when you look at the news, and you may not be aware the Bible talks about a subject, but 1 in 16 can say, oh no, the Bible talks about that right here. So that applicability of Bible to real life is very missing today. And we see a real decline in people who profess Christianity, for example. Faith in America is plummeting. It's way down. You see here the chart. Back in the year 2000, 85% of Americans professed to be Christians. In the year 2020, just 20 years later, it was down to 65%. That's a 20% drop in 20 years. That's a lot of slippage. And in polling, say to those people, why don't you go to church anymore? 2 out of 3 said, because it lacks relevancy. I really don't get anything that pertains to daily life. And that's what the American War for Independence, that whole era was built on making the Bible relevant for everything that goes on, knowing how God thought about issues. So, and by the way, that's part of what happened. When it's time for Moses to take them into the promised land, they're still thinking like slaves. Okay, it's going to take another generation. Go out there for 40 years. Well, the next generation will give them a try. And so it sometimes takes a while to throw off the bad thinking that you've had for 400 years. And the church, we've had bad thinking for a few generations now, and it takes a while to get recharged on that. And this is why people are saying we need a revival in America, and we're praying for revival. And this is all good stuff, except I don't think it's going to happen the way we plan. The major problem we have is right now we have an obsession with the national focus. Let me explain. Everybody gets their news from somewhere today. If you're on the right, it's probably going to be, I don't know, it's going to be Fox News, or it's going to be Blaze, or Epic Times, it's going to be Victory News, or Newsmax, whatever. If you're on the left, it's going to be MSNBC, or CNN, whatever. It doesn't matter. Everybody gets a heavy dose of national news. As a result of that, we all are pretty well aware of what's going on at the Capitol, at the Supreme Court, and at the White House. We know about that. Here's the deal. If I ask most people, name the President of the United States, they can. If I ask most people, name the President of your local school board, they can't. If I say, name me 3 legislators at the federal level who make policy, they can. If I say, name 3 city legislators who make city policy, city council members, they can't. See, we know more about what goes on nationally than we do all around us, and we can't change what goes on nationally, but we can change what goes on around us. It's just we know less about it. So we're so fixated on something we can't. And by the way, let me just real quickly share a story here. I'm very connected at that level. Back in December of 2015 is when ISIS moved into Iraq, and they were going to set up the global caliphate. And so as they did, we watched as they went through, just murdering as they went. You may recall that as ISIS went in with this army to set up that caliphate, they had scouts out front, and the scouts would go from home to home and find what was there. And if they found a home of a Christian person, they would paint the Arabic symbol none on it, which is, it's kind of like a capital U with a dot in the middle. And they paint that in red spray paint on the side, and they keep moving. A couple hours later, the army comes through, and if they found that Arabic symbol none, and that meant Nazarene, these are followers of the Nazarene, these are Christians. And at that house, the army would stop, they would erect a sharpened pole in the yard, and they would impale the entire family on the pole, from daddy on the bottom to infant up top. And that was the message to everybody else that, no, you're going to be our religion and nothing else. And if you're anything else, this is what's going to befall you. So we watched at that point in time as Christians by the hundreds of thousands are being taken out. So Glenn Beck, a good friend of mine, started the Nazarene Fund. He and I run the Nazarene Fund. And so we started rescuing Christians and religious minorities. Anybody that thereafter, we're going to get them out of there. And we sent, I don't know, thousands, scores of thousands to Australia and to Brazil and Slovakia and to Canada. We couldn't send any to the United States. The United States wouldn't take persecuted Christians. They'd take anybody else, but we had to send them elsewhere. And so then the caliphate gets wiped out in 2017, 2018. And so at that point, that's where we turn our attention to what's happening, because they take religious minorities and they say, well, we're not in power anymore, but we need money to survive. And they would kidnap Christians and Yazidis and others. and they would kill them and harvest their organs and sell their organs on the black market. So organ harvesting, you get $50,000 for a heart, $30,000 for a pair of lungs, $20,000 for a liver, and that's how they kept it going. So we would go in and shut down organ harvesting farms. We would go and do snatch and grabs, take slaves away, as I mentioned earlier. And so when we get to last year, the president announced that we're going to be completely out of Afghanistan at the end of August. And the military said, well, leave 2,500 at Bagram. No, we're taking everybody out. So as you remember, by the first week of August, the enemy knew that we were going out, and so 20 different terrorist groups moved into Afghanistan. And by the way, let me mention, the guy who runs our operations for us, our ground operations, he was the chief of intelligence for Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. He was the chief of intelligence for Secretary of Defense Gates, and he was in the National Security Council with President Trump. So he's considered the top intelligence guy militarily in all of North Africa and all of the Middle East. And he's the guy who runs our operations. So as we saw things falling apart in Afghanistan, 20 different terrorist groups move in. We're embedded at the airport trying to keep ISIS and the other bad guys off us. Women are throwing their children over the fence trying to save them, get them to America. The first week of August, we got a call from the military, from JSOC, and they said, would you guys take over the evacuation of civilians? We got our hands full getting the military stuff out of here. Will you do this civilian? We said, sure. So we stepped in and we got thousands and thousands and thousands of folks out. We got 1,200 Americans out immediately. We got a bunch of SIV, P1, P2 passport holders. That's the allies who fought with the Americans against the bad guys. We got thousands of persecuted Christians, religious minorities out. So we got these folks going out. And we found that despite having 20 different terrorist groups there, our biggest problem wasn't the terrorist groups. Our biggest problem was the State Department. Literally, we had a plane going to Macedonia loaded up with 340 folks. And no, turn that plane back. Don't let that plane land. Well, when they get back, ISIS is waiting for them because they know that if that plane went out, it's people they're looking for, that they want. So guess what happened to those people? And then we had other planes that were going to Albania, and State Department called ahead and said, no, turn those planes back and don't let them land. So guess what happens to them when they get back? So all this going on, I say, okay, I started calling a bunch of U.S. senators I know and a bunch of U.S. congressmen I know, say, guys, here's the situation, here's what's happening on the ground. We got the support of the Prime Minister of Pakistan. He's actually helping us get people out, but the American State Department is blocking us. So they called in Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, and said, don't let the State Department do that. So he called in the Middle East desk of the State Department, and he says, don't stop those planes anymore. You make sure they get out of there. And they looked at him and said, no, we're not. We don't want those planes going out of there. He said, I'm your Secretary of State. Stop them. He said, stop this. And he said, no, we're not. Because you see, you can't fire upper level State Department folks. That's what Trump found out. That's what presidents have found out all the way back to Reagan. As a matter of fact, all the way back to Truman. Truman specifically said he wanted the embassy set up in Jerusalem. It ends up in Tel Aviv in 1950. And that was because he announced it was going to Jerusalem. State Department said, no, that's not a good idea. He said, I told you to put it in Jerusalem. I said, no, it's not a good idea. So we've been fighting the State Department all the way back to George Marshall at the end of World War II. It's been its own entity. So I can't get anything done. And I've got contacts at federal level all over. And so I couldn't get it. This is why most Americans, they really get frustrated and they really get angry, and we really feel paralyzed over it, because I can't make anything happen. I can't call Pelosi and get something done. I can't call McConnell and get something done. We can't do it. The problem we've got is stop looking at the federal level. Look at the local level. We get paralyzed at that level. And let me show you the historical precedent for that. If I take you back to the American War for Independence, the first 4 battles in the American War for Independence, top right around, Lexington, Concord, Road to Boston, and Bunker Hill. All of those battles, like at Lexington, we're outnumbered 10-1 by the British. Nobody called George and said, George, you're the national commander-in-chief. Send us help now. We're in serious trouble. Nobody called George. And the reason was they all had this mentality is, it's our community. We'll take care of our community. George, we need you doing a bunch of stuff, but we got this community. And so everybody was looking after the community, which is why of the more than 80 battles in the American Revolution, most of them were won at the local level. Now, we needed George at Brandywine and at Monmouth and at Yorktown, but even there, the local troops showed up in big numbers to help them win those battles. So it's significant that let me just take you through it real quick, this local mentality. The top one, the Battle of Lexington, April 19, 1775, 700 British come to town, And there's 70 Americans to face them. Now, our textbooks say that 70 courageous Americans went out to face them. That's not true. What happened is Reverend Jonas Clark took his church out to face the British, and he had 70 guys in the church. And so when they got out there, the British were on their way to Concord because they're going into the stores, seizing what they want out of the stores. They plan to go into the homes, seize what they want. British Bill of Rights says you can't do that. And the Americans went out there to say, you're not going to Concord. We're stopping you right here at Lexington. So what happened was Pastor Clark had been telling them, guys, we've had conflict going for a while. We might get into a war. If we get into a war, here's what the scriptures teach about war. You can't have an offensive war. You can have a defensive war. You can defend yourself. So you've got Exodus 22, and you got twice in Nehemiah. You've got once over in Luke. So defensive war is fine. So when they went out that morning, their deacon, John Parker, who had been training them, gave them a speech that morning. This is the Minutemen statue in Lexington that you can see today. And he said, remember what Pastor's been telling us. He said, stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. We got some backbone. We're not going to let them cross this line, but you don't get to shoot till they've started something. So what happened that morning is we lost that battle by a big margin. It would not have mattered if we'd had SEAL Team 6 on our side, because you had 700 single-shot muskets facing 70 single-shot muskets, and they get the first volley. So once they shoot into the Americans, 18 Americans hit the ground. No British hit the ground that morning at all, and the British promptly marched through Lexington, go to Concord, and again, our history books tell us that some 300 to 400 courageous Americans went out to stop the British at Concord. Not true. The Reverend William Emerson took his church out there and said, guys, we're stopping at the bridge. You're not coming into our town. We're not going to let you do this in our town. And so that's where the conflict happened. And he said, by the way, did we hear that you shot at our brethren over at Lexington? Or have you guys started a war? Game on. And that's where the first British hit the ground. And so the British commander said, this is not good. I had 70 Americans I faced. Now I'm facing 300 to 400. I've only got 700. If I don't get back to Boston and get reinforcements really quickly, I'm going to be in serious problem. And that's the third battle, Road to Boston. It's a 19-mile running battle where the British were trying to head back to Charleston to get reinforcements. And they were burning American homes all along the way. And as they're burning these homes along the way, the Americans said, you're not going to do this to our property. We have rights. We have British Bill of Rights. So 4,500 Americans lined the road on both sides shooting at the British as they were going by, burning stuff. Now, where'd all those 4,500 Americans come? Well, Reverend Benjamin Balch brought his church out there. Reverend Payson Phillips brought his church out there. Again, it was all these local groups saying, you're not going to do this in our community. When enough local communities say that, it creates a national change. And that's where change came from back then. So we look at it, and even the Battle of Bunker Hill, Reverend Joseph Willard said, I've got 2 companies here in the church. Let's go join the other churches across town and defend Boston. And that's literally the way that battle after battle went in the War for Independence. It was focused on local battles, and that's where you get a national victory, is by winning the local stuff. You know, as Chad said, we looked at Virginia. You get Virginia, pick off a state here. We're working in Colorado. We're working in a lot of states where we're seeing significant changes, and it's a good start. You got to get that going in all the states to have a real national change. The thing I would point to with revivals, and Christians are praying for revival, and that's a good prayer, but you're not going to have a national revival. Now, wait a minute. You had the Great Awakening. Wasn't that a national revival? It sure looks like it, doesn't it? I mean, after all, George Whitfield preached 34 years in America. In 34 years, he preached 18,000 sermons, and it is estimated that 80% of all Americans physically heard him preach a sermon. Now, that's message penetration. Twitter, Facebook, any of the big tech guys would love to have 80%. And even with big tech, they're nowhere close to 80%. So how did he do it? It's real easy. He was chaplain of the state of Georgia. He got on his horse. He had a portable pulpit. He tied behind him on his horse, and he rode to Maine, which was the northern part of Massachusetts at the time. It wasn't a separate state till 50 years later. And he stopped at every single town he went through, and he preached in every town he went through. Then when he got to Maine, he turned around and rode back to Georgia, but he took a different route and preached in every town he went through. He did that 7 times. It took him 34 years, 7 trips. The reason 80% of Americans physically heard him preach a sermon was because he was in 80% of the towns in America having revivals. And those revivals, as they would start in a town, it was the local pastors who would keep it going. It was, for example, when they started in the western wilderness area of Virginia, it was Reverend Samuel Davies who kept the revival going another 19 years after it started there. It was Reverend Gilbert Tennant who kept it going in Philadelphia, Reverend Samuel Cooper who kept it going in Boston. So it was local revivals. We think it's a national revival. It was really local revivals, and that's where the focus has to be. So the focus on local stuff is significant, and that also goes true when it comes to civic things. And we're talking about making civic changes. Let me take you through some quick numbers here. To vote in America is pretty simple stuff. 2 constitutional requirements. We require, number 1, you be 18 years old, and number 2, you be a legal citizen. If you can meet those 2 requirements, 100% of those people can vote in America. 100% of people 18 and older who are legal citizens can vote. One more thing you have to do. You have to register to vote, because we want to make sure that there's voter integrity. We want to make sure you didn't vote 17 times or somebody didn't vote 17 times in your name, and so you register to vote. This is where only 65.3% of adults have registered to vote. You have roughly 100 million Americans who said, I don't care what happens, I ain't going to be part of nothing. So that's roughly 1/3 of the nation that are able to vote that don't vote just because they won't fill out a piece of paper. And then when you look at elections, we have 2 types of elections in America. The first type is what we call presidential elections. This is where you get the highest voter turnout. For the last 11 presidential elections, the average voter turnout has been 54%. But that's not 54% of adults. That's 54% of registered voters. That's 54% of 65.3%, which means it's 36% of adults that vote for president. It takes half that to win the presidential election. The other kind of election we have is what we have this year, where we start choosing congressmen and senators and governors and legislators. And at that point, now you guys, you're one of the off-year elections for governor, like Virginia is, but you're choosing congressmen and senators and such this year. And in those off-year elections, the average voter turnout is 38%, but that's 38% of 65.3%, which is 26%. It takes half that to win, which is 13%. So what you have for the last 11 presidential elections, 1 out of 5 Americans chooses the president of the United States, and 1 out of 8 Americans chooses our congressmen and our senators. So that's really low, but when you get to the local level, it's even lower. It averages around 6%, but that's 6% of 65.3%, which is 4% of adults vote in local elections, and it takes half of that to win. I'll give you an example. Take you to Los Angeles. Los Angeles, the population is so large that the population of Los Angeles is larger than 23 separate individual states. So if you're Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, remember how hostile he was to faith? He said, oh, you can't have any type of worship. So he shut down churches, shut down synagogues. You're not essential. Remember all that? He's really hostile to all this stuff. Eric Garcetti brags about the fact that he was elected with 2.9% of the vote. He gets that much power and 2.9%. Let me take you to Houston, my state of Texas. Houston's the 4th largest city in the nation. It's larger than the population of 20 individual states. Houston elected an East Parker mayor with 4.9% of the registered vote. That's 3.3% of the actual adults choosing her. When she was elected, she passed what was called HERO, Houston Equal Rights Ordinance, and she says, marriage, if you say marriage between a man and a woman, that's a crime and I'm going to prosecute you. She instantly went after 5 pastors who had said that back in the Texas Marriage Amendment when we passed a constitutional amendment to the Texas Constitution. She said, I know you guys have. So she subpoenaed 17 forms of communication. She said, I want to see all your text messages. I want to hear all your voice messages. I want to see all your sermon notes. I want to see all your published sermons. I want to check all your social media. And if you have said marriage between a man and a woman, that's a crime and I'm going to nail you for it. Well, at that point, we got 4,500 churches involved and said, why don't we have a referendum on this? Why don't we put this on the ballot? So we got to put on the ballot. The day before the election, Houston Chronicle ran a poll and said, we're going to lose. Our side's going to lose 60-40. The city is firmly behind Denise Parker, and she's going to win this. And the next day we had the election, 14% turnout, and she got crushed by 22 points. So it was a 61-39 election. That meant the poll was off by 42 points. Okay, because they said it'd be 20-point win for her. It's a 22-point loss for her. It's a 42-point swing. And Matt pointed out 14%, that is really pathetic. I mean, that's really, yeah, but it's 5 times higher than what it had been. Just by getting the faith vote up that little bit, it became disproportionately a landslide on the other side. See, we're kind of even Steven right now with the other side, and we're just not really even engaged. If we ever get engaged, especially at the local level, things change in a hurry. Take you to another city, Fort Worth, Texas. Fort Worth, 6.5 years ago, this is where the school board of Fort Worth said, you know, we've examined it and we're not going to do the gender stuff anymore. We're going to let kids choose whatever bathroom they want. They can choose whatever locker room they want. They can choose whatever shower room they want. We're just not going to do the gender stuff. And at that point, Arne Duncan, who was the Secretary of Education for President Obama, said, I should have thought of that. That's a brilliant idea. He said, here's the new federal policy. If your public school gets tax dollars, you can't do gender stuff at your school. That's out. And that's 97% of the public schools in America. Now, this particularly bothered me because I'm a cowboy from Texas, literally. Got the ranch, got the cows and horses, got the pickup truck, everything that goes with it. So, cowboy from Texas. If you don't know about Fort Worth, Texas, the nickname of Fort Worth, Texas is called Cowtown, USA. Twice a day on Main Street in Fort Worth, we have a cattle drive up and down Main Street. We close off Main Street and we take this herd of longhorns up and down. This is Cowtown, USA. This is where the West begins, is the other slogan we have. Now, see that herd of cattle right there? You may not be a cowboy, you may have no ranch experience, all it doesn't matter. I can take any one of you and put you behind that herd, and you can quickly tell me which are the bulls, which are the cows, and which are the steers. Really, it doesn't take a cowboy degree to know that. And we've never seen a bull become a cow, and we've never seen a cow become a bull. And it was Fort Worth, Texas that started. So I looked at the city, and the city is the 13th largest in the United States. Fort Worth has 918,000 there. And the guy on the school board, the president of the school board who introduced the silly policy that went national, he was elected with less than 1,200 votes. Matter of fact, it's 1,182 votes. So I looked in his district where he ran and quickly found dozens of evangelical Bible-believing churches in his district. I found one church alone that had more than 3,000 registered Bible-believing adults in that church. That one church could have kept him from being on the school board, which would have saved the entire nation from 6.5 years of nonsense that we went through. But it wasn't handled at the local level. And that war could have been won right there at the local level. Two more examples. If I take you to Bentonville, Arkansas, Bentonville is a town of 40,000. It's the home of Walmart. A lady in Bentonville said, you're not going to do this at our schools. And so she ran for school board and she got elected. There were a total of 35 votes cast, and she won the majority of 35 votes. 40,000 people, 35 votes for school board, she won the majority. Yeah, but that's not even as good as what happened in Riceville, Iowa. In Riceville, Iowa, there was a farmer there who said, you're definitely not doing this in our schools. And so he ran for school board, got his name on the ballot. And when it turned up election day, he got busy on the farm, and it turned out he didn't go vote. And don't think he lost by one vote. The story is not, that's not the story. The story is not a single person voted in the school board election. Had he voted for himself, he would be on the school board just by voting for himself. See, this is the local level. This is where you can win battles. You're not going to win them at the federal level. You can win. Now, we want good people at the federal level. There's no question. And we should be voting good people at the federal level. But my goodness, it's so much easier to win the stuff around us and win there, and then it trickles up. So the local focus is important. Bringing this, wrapping down, Benjamin Rush, John Adams said he's one of the three most notable. He's called the father of public schools under the Constitution. And the reason is he did this piece in 1790. The piece that he did in 1790 on the mode of education proper in a republic, he said, you know, we used to be 13 separate nations. Now we're one nation with 13 states. If we're going to be a United States, what do we need to be teaching in our schools to be a United States? He said, the purpose of public education is threefold. He said, our schools should teach, he said, our schools first and foremost should teach students to love and serve God. He said, our public schools second should teach students to love and serve their country. And our schools third should teach students to love and serve their family. Now, most faith people I know put it in a different order. They would say, no, 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 it should be God, and then it should be family, and it should be country, because family is so important. He said, no, you're wrong. It should be God, it should be country, it should be family, because he said if you ever lose control of your country will become the great enemy to your family. And this is exactly what we've seen happening with local schools. I mean, as it turns out, over the last 3 years, we found out what's being taught, and we found this is the real cesspool of what's going on in so many areas. And now we're seeing Loudoun County, Virginia, and Fairfax. We saw all the stuff going there 3 years ago, and now all over the nation, people are getting involved, and that's why school board has become such an active race right now. Significantly, when you look at what happened with school boards, let me take you to, I'm going to pass this poll for a minute. Let me take you to local look at elections. Chad mentioned Virginia. Okay, in Virginia, there's tens of thousands of churches, got 312 churches. Virginia said, yeah, we need to make a difference in last November's election. So went in January, 11 months ahead, and said, let's get organized, let's make a difference. So in those 312 churches, Faith Winds went in, got them all organized. Those 312 churches, interesting thing happened. They said, let's just look with the people who go to churches every week. We know their values, we know their heart. Let's just find people who have never, ever voted in their whole life. They've never registered to vote, never voted. Let's just get them. That's easy stuff. So they found 77,000 that had never before voted, never before registered to vote, got them registered, they voted, and Yonkin won by 63,000. So those 312, and none of them are mega churches, they're all just community churches, but that was enough to make the difference, but didn't stop there. 1 Timothy 4 in the scripture says, no one wins a race unless he runs according to the rules. Most people don't know the rules of elections. So out of those 312 churches, there were 1,300 people who says, we need to learn the rules. So 300 were state certified election officials, 1,000 of them became poll watchers, and those 1,300 identified 5.2% of the ballots as fraudulent. They found one guy who had registered to vote 27 different locations. They found a vacant lot that had 17 people vote off that vacant lot. Can't do that. 5.2% of the vote being fraudulent, that's enough to win an election. And then on top of that, they said, all right, as Chad mentioned, out here in the country where we still have a brain, we still know how to think, we're going to have to overperform the city guys. And they did. Instead of having a 35% turnout in the country, they had a 64% turnout in the country. And that's the third thing. So churches made the difference there. In Colorado, 1,500 churches got involved and said, we need to look at local school boards. They took dozens and scores of school board positions in Colorado. As a matter of fact, just headlines across the nation. Run through some headlines real quick. This one, Canada's opposing critical race theory, COVID-19 mandates win Minnesota. I think they're more blue than you guys are. Minnesota is super blue, and yet conservatives won the school board, Minnesota. And then I love this one. This is out of Jersey. You guys should, you may or may not have seen this headline. I love this. 19-year-old who saw his senior year disrupted by COVID shutdowns unseats the incumbent in the school board race. So he ran against the guy who shut the school down, and he missed a senior year, and he beat the guy by 17 points. And I'll point out, it is really nice to finally have some adults on the school board in Jersey. I mean, it's just really good to have some show up. Then you have this one, Denver. Yeah, we won the school board in Denver. That's a really blue state, a really blue city. Wichita, that's the second most liberal city in Kansas. It's Kansas City, and then Wichita, got the school board there. In Treasure Valley, that's Boise, the most liberal city in Idaho. We got the school board there. Back up to Dallas. Tuesday, 2 weeks ago, 15 open spots in Dallas. Dallas is the second bluest city in all of Texas. Houston and Dallas, they're the two crazies. And so, well, Austin goes with that too, so maybe 3 cities. So, but Dallas is one of the top ones, and there were 15 open school board seats, and we got all 15 school board seats. There were 51 churches. 51 churches got involved, and those 51 churches were enough to get 15 out of 15 on the school board in Dallas. You have Colorado Springs. All 4 school boards in Colorado Springs completely flipped, took every race, every position, all 4 school boards. Houston, we got the school board in Houston. That's 2.3 million in that city. And we got the school board positions in Houston. I just, headline after headline. This is not what people are hearing. This is where the victories get won, is right here. And this is where we got to get our eyes focused, and this is what will make a difference. So final thing I've got, and then I'll throw it back to Chad. Charles Finney, a revivalist in the Second Great Awakening. Charles Finney believed that revivals is not something you pray for, it's something you can have. And he wrote a book in 1835 on how to have revivals. And his position was, there's a lot of if-then verses in the Bible. 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people, which are called by my name, will do this, God says, then I'll do this. So if you want the this, why don't you just do the this? You know, if you'll do the if, he'll do the then. You don't have to pray about that. Just do it. And so that's what he looked at, all the verses in the Bible, if then. And lecture number 15, he goes through all these different verses. Lecture 15 is significant. He says in lecture 15, the church must take right ground in regard to politics. Politics are part of a religion in a country as this, because this is a stewardship country. This is our government. It belongs to us. It doesn't belong to them. It belongs to we the people. It's a stewardship. He said, and Christians must do their duty to the country as part of their duty to God. He said, God will bless or curse this nation according to the course that Christians take in politics. Now, the title of this lecture was Hindrances to Revival. He said, if you refuse to get involved in civil affairs, if you refuse to get involved in politics, you're not going to have a revival in the nation. Why? Because, see, I've been involved in 13 cases at the U.S. Supreme Court, involved in another case this year. We're fighting all over the nation now that when people just express their faith, they get squashed by the system. You can't believe how many thousands of lawsuits we have going because somebody does something that anybody else could do, but if you're a Christian or if you're a person of faith and do it, you can't. That's wrong. You know how hard it is to have a revival when you can't publicly express your faith? You can't go into schools, you can't go into universities, you can't go in the medical profession, you can't go in the military. It's never been that way. See, that's what happens. If you don't get involved, it's a hindrance to revival. So this is a challenge that I give you. If this stuff is new to you, I'd sent you on the back table out there. We have a lot of materials, things like we have, for example, the American Story, which goes through a lot of the stuff you're hearing here. But thank you guys for letting me share with you. Chad, all yours.
Y'all give him a hand. David Barton. I don't know anybody that wants to debate him. That's right. Y'all give him a hand. He deserves it. I'm blown away because I feel like I got ripped off, right? I love history, and I feel like nobody taught me this stuff. And I just finished reading that American Story the second time. It's real short little chapters that help you digest it. Because if he doesn't challenge your thinking, you're not listening, right? Because we haven't been taught this stuff, and then he ties it into truth, and it's amazing. And it really puts the challenge on you, right? It's an individual responsibility. We don't become a Christian by going to a good church any more than we become a car by being in a garage. It's an individual responsibility and decision to accept Christ's sacrifice on the cross for us. And so we just thought, man, let's take people around, take David and Cheryl around and let them teach this stuff to people. And maybe it inspires you, because we can't do anything in New Jersey. I don't get a vote here. You know, I can't affect the school board or the city council or the county council. But I do know that when Christians get involved, good things happen. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. And you can't expect righteous behavior or righteous policy if you don't get righteous people involved. You know, we were really heavily involved in Virginia, and it was mamas and daddies and just saying, wow, my kids are being taught that, or they're not being taught that. So I challenge you, read the book, get it to your kids, grandkids, make sure you study that. And we just want to help you get involved. I don't know if y'all have that QR code you can throw back up there, but if you want us to tie you in, I've got one pastor in Virginia, actually. He got involved in an election board because he dove in and he read the statute. And he goes in to meet with the election officials, and one guy had been there 35 years, and Pastor Tom said, hey, are you doing this? And the guy said, we've never done it that way. Tom said, how long have you been here? And the guy said, I've been on the board for 35 years. Tom said, you've been breaking the law for 35 years? Because the guy that was executing the law didn't even know. And it was a local person sitting in a meeting like this one day. So if you hit that, and look, we don't need your donors or money or anything else. We've been blessed, and we're around the country just trying to teach the truth about American history. People are not being taught this stuff, and I love it, and I love learning about it, and every time I hear David, I learn something new. Look, we'd love to have you again. I'd love to get him back in New Jersey. We're going to be in Basking Ridge at King of Kings Church tonight. I really appreciate y'all coming out on a Wednesday afternoon. It means a lot to us. Pastor Matt, you're awesome. You want to come close in prayer, brother? And God bless y'all. Thanks for coming. Pastor, you want to come close?
Hey, we want to thank you all for coming, and we certainly thank David and his wife and Chad for coming today. Are you blessed today? Amen. This is stuff we need to know. It's stuff we need to hear, and it's stuff we need to share. Amen. Jesus, I thank you for this time that we've had together today. We thank you for biblical history, and Lord, we thank you for our national history. And Lord, we thank you that we are a people who desire still to honor you and be salt and light in this world around us. Lord, we ask you to take what we have learned today, make it part of who we are, that we might share Christ with the world around us. Lord, turn this culture around for the sake of your gospel. Save souls, Lord, who are so lost. Lord, we just pray that you would do these things in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you all. Please remember that David has a table in the back with some of his items, that's something that might be of interest to you. We thank you so very much for joining us today. God bless you all.